The year was 793, and the quiet island of Lindisfarne off the coast of England had no warning of what was coming. As monks prayed in their monastery, the horizon filled with the ominous shapes of Viking longships, sleek, dragon-proud vessels carrying warriors hungry for glory and gold. By the time the sun set, the sacred grounds were drenched in chaos. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just another attack. It was the thunderclap that announced the Vikings' arrival on the world stage. In that single brutal stroke, these Norse seafarers sent a message that echoed across Europe. No coast was safe, no treasure beyond their reach. But what began as raids would evolve into something far greater, a series of conquests so audacious they'd redraw the maps of continents and rewrite the course of history. For centuries, the Vikings have been painted as mere raiders, their legacy reduced to horned helmets and burning villages. But the truth is far more fascinating. These were master navigators, shrewd traders, and cunning strategists who ventured farther than any European civilization before them. From the frozen shores of Greenland to the bustling markets of Constantinople, their footprints spanned the known world. They didn't just take, they settled, intermarried, and transformed the cultures they encountered. Their sagas tell of kings and explorers, of battles fought not just with axes but with diplomacy. So how did a people from the rugged fjords of Scandinavia become the architects of empires, the founders of dynasties, and the catalysts for global change? That's the story we're about to unravel. Over the next 20 tales, we'll trace the Vikings' most notorious conquests, the campaigns that shifted borders, toppled kingdoms, and left an indelible mark on history. You'll witness the fall of Paris, the founding of Dublin, and the daring voyages that brought them to the edge of the known world. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were calculated moves in a grand game of power and survival. By the end, you'll see the Vikings not as mindless marauders, but as the architects of a new era, one where the world map was forever changed by their ambition. So ready your shield and sharpen your curiosity. The age of the Vikings is about to come alive. The Viking Age, spanning from 793 to 1066, was more than just an era of raids. It was a seismic shift in world history. Picture a society where power wasn't just held by kings, but by fierce jarls, ambitious warriors, and cunning traders. Norse culture thrived on competition, honor, and a deep connection to the sea. Their legendary longships, with shallow drafts and flexible hulls, could glide up rivers and cross oceans alike, turning the Vikings into the ultimate seafaring predators. But what drove these men to leave their fjords and strike out into the unknown? It wasn't just about plunder, though silver and riches certainly played their part. Scandinavia's rugged landscape offered little fertile land, and as populations grew, so did the hunger for new territories. Trade routes stretched from the icy north to the bustling markets of Baghdad, and the Vikings were determined to control them. Men like Ragnar Lothbrok, whether historical warlord or mythic hero, became symbols of this restless ambition. Their sagas spoke of fame, fortune, and the favor of the gods, all won through daring exploits. Yet beneath the tales of blood and battle lay something far more surprising: adaptability. The Vikings weren't just destroyers, they were settlers, diplomats, and even rulers. They founded cities like Dublin and York, negotiated with emperors in Constantinople, and carved out kingdoms from England to Sicily. Their influence rippled across continents, blending Norse traditions with the cultures they encountered. By the time the Viking Age drew to a close, they had reshaped Europe's political map, leaving behind a legacy far more complex than the horned helmeted raiders of popular imagination. So when those first longships appeared on the horizon at Lindisfarne, they weren't just announcing a raid, they were heralding an era of transformation. What followed would change the course of history as the Vikings turned from coastal marauders into empire builders. The peaceful island of Lindisfarne had stood for centuries as a beacon of Christian devotion, its monastery a treasure trove of illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. But on June 8, 793, that serenity shattered. Without warning, the longships appeared swift, silent, and utterly merciless. The Viking raiders fell upon the undefended monastery like wolves among sheep, leaving devastation in their wake. Gold and silver vanished into Norse hands, precious manuscripts burned, and those who resisted met swift steel. The monks who survived wrote of their horror, their quills trembling as they described the desecration of holy ground. Alcuin of York, a scholar at Charlemagne's court, lamented, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." This wasn't just another raid, it was a psychological earthquake. Christian Europe had believed itself safe behind the walls of faith, but Lindisfarne proved no sanctuary was sacred to these seafaring warriors. The attack exposed the vulnerability of coastal communities, sending rulers scrambling to bolster their defenses. Monasteries, once seen as peaceful retreats, suddenly became prime targets, their wealth unprotected by armies. For the Vikings, Lindisfarne was a revelation. They discovered that the richest treasures often lay in the most vulnerable places, guarded only by prayer. Yet the raid's true significance went deeper than plunder. It marked the moment the Vikings realized their potential. The longship's speed and versatility allowed them to strike anywhere, vanish before reinforcements arrived, and return home laden with riches. Word spread quickly through Norse halls the lands to the south were ripe for the taking. Within years, Viking fleets descended on Scotland, Ireland, and Francia, each raid bolder than the last. Lindisfarne had shown them the way, and they would follow it with a relentless hunger that reshaped Europe. What began as an opportunistic strike became the spark of an era. The monks' horrified accounts painted the Vikings as demons, but history would reveal a far more complex truth. These raiders were also explorers, settlers, and traders, yet on that fateful June day, they announced their arrival with fire and steel. Lindisfarne wasn't just the start of the Viking Age. It was the first stroke of a brush that would paint new kingdoms, rewrite trade routes, and forge legends that endure to this day. If Lindisfarne announced the Vikings' arrival, the Siege of Paris in 845 proved they could strike at the very heart of Europe's power. Picture the scene, a massive fleet of 120 longships gliding up the Seine, their dragon-headed prows casting shadows on the riverbanks as they advanced toward the Frankish capital. At their helm stood the notorious Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure straddling myth and history, whose name alone sent shivers through the courts of Europe. Paris, still a modest island city but already a jewel in the Frankish crown, had never faced such a threat from the water. The defenders watched in horror as Viking warriors dragged their ships onto the banks, surrounding the city with a ring of steel and fire. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Ragnar's forces stormed the outskirts, overwhelming the local defenses with terrifying speed. But rather than sack the city outright, the Vikings played a longer game. They knew Paris's true value lay not in its churches or homes, but in the fear its fall would inspire. When King Charles the Bald scrambled to rally his armies, Ragnar offered him a choice: pay an unimaginable ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver, or watch his capital burn. The Franks, unprepared for such audacity, emptied their coffers. This wasn't just plunder, it was the birth of Danegeld, the infamous tax paid to buy off Viking raiders, a practice that would haunt Europe for generations. The raid's brilliance lay in its strategic foresight. By targeting Paris, Ragnar demonstrated how Viking longships could transform rivers into highways of conquest. The Seine, like the Rhine or the Loire, became a dagger pointed at the continent's heart. Fortresses meant to stop land armies were useless against these seaborne invaders, who could strike deep inland and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The Franks, humiliated and bankrupt, responded by building fortified bridges and walled towns, a desperate attempt to stem the tide. But the lesson was clear: no kingdom was safe from the reach of Norse ambition. Yet Paris was more than a victory, it was a blueprint. Word of Ragnar's success spread like wildfire through Viking halls, igniting a hunger for greater exploits. If one fleet could extort a king's ransom, what might others achieve? The rivers of Europe, once veins of trade and communication, now became avenues of terror. And as Frankish silver flooded back to Scandinavia, it fueled more ships, more warriors, and more audacious dreams. The age of hit-and-run raids was evolving into something far grander, a campaign of conquest that would soon turn Norse adventurers into kings of foreign lands. The Siege of Paris didn't just fill Viking coffers, it reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Kings now ruled at the mercy of the longships, and the map of Francia began to bend under the weight of Norse pressure. But this was only the beginning. As the Vikings realized their strength, their gaze turned westward to lands where no Frankish army could follow, and where even greater fortunes awaited those bold enough to claim them. While Paris trembled under Viking siege, another conquest was unfolding far to the west, one that would transform a muddy estuary into one of Europe's most notorious trading hubs. In 841, a Norse warlord named Turgesius led his fleet into the sheltered waters where the river Liffey met the Irish Sea. The Gaelic locals called it Dublin, the Black Pool, a crossing point for cattle and a gathering place for tribes. But Turgesius saw something far grander, the perfect stronghold to control Ireland's riches. Within years, Viking axes felled trees for shipyards, and Dublin rose from the marshes as a bustling fortress of commerce and conquest. This was no temporary raiding camp. The Vikings built Dublin with the precision of seasoned settlers, erecting sturdy wooden houses, defensive earthworks, and a sprawling marketplace that drew traders from across the known world. Silver dirhams from Baghdad mingled with Frankish coins and Irish jewelry, proof of the city's reach. But Dublin's darkest commodity was human. The slave markets here became infamous, where captives from Ireland, Scotland, and even as far as Spain were bought and sold. The Norse didn't just raid, they industrialized exploitation, turning Dublin into the heart of a grim Atlantic network. Yet violence alone couldn't sustain a kingdom. What made Dublin endure was cultural fusion. Norse settlers married into Gaelic families, blending languages and traditions. Viking kings like Olaf the White adopted Irish titles, while local clans learned Norse shipbuilding techniques. Over time, Dublin became a hybrid world where Gaelic poets recited sagas of Viking heroes, and Norse merchants traded in Irish wool. This wasn't conquest, it was collaboration, however uneasy. The Kingdom of Dublin lasted nearly 3 centuries, outliving many Viking realms elsewhere, precisely because its rulers understood the power of adaptation. Dublin's true legacy, though, lay beyond its walls. From this bustling port, Viking explorers launched expeditions that stretched the map of the known world. Young warriors, restless for new horizons, sailed west to Iceland and Greenland, following rumors of untouched lands. The same shipbuilding skills honed in Dublin's docks would later carry Leif Erikson to the shores of North America. What began as a raider's haven became a launch pad for the greatest voyages of the Viking Age, proof that even their most notorious conquests were stepping stones to something far greater. The story of Dublin shatters the myth of Vikings as mere destroyers. Here, they were city builders, lawgivers, and cultural bridge builders. Their imprint lingers not just in Ireland's archaeology, but in its bloodlines where Norse DNA still threads through modern populations. When we walk Dublin's streets today, we tread the same paths where Viking and Gaelic footsteps once merged, a reminder that history's most transformative conquests aren't always measured in battles, but in the silent, stubborn persistence of a new way of life. By the year 865, England had weathered Viking raids for decades, but nothing could prepare the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for what came next. This wasn't a scattered fleet of raiders, it was an invasion force of unprecedented scale, a relentless war machine known as the Great Heathen Army. Led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, this army wasn't after mere plunder. They came to conquer. The scale of their ambition was staggering. Landing in East Anglia, the Vikings exploited the fractured rivalries between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, playing kings against each other like pieces on a chessboard. Northumbria, torn apart by civil war, fell first. The city of York, a bustling trade hub, became their stronghold, its streets echoing with Old Norse instead of Old English. But the most chilling moment came in East Anglia, where King Edmund refused to renounce his faith or surrender his lands. The Vikings, unimpressed by martyrdom, executed him with brutal symbolism, some say tied to a tree and shot with arrows, a sacrifice to Odin himself. Edmund's death wasn't just a killing, it was a message. Resistance meant annihilation. Mercia collapsed next, its king paying tribute to buy temporary safety. Yet the Great Heathen Army's true legacy wasn't just in the kingdoms it toppled, but in the borders it redrew. By 877, nearly half of England lay under Norse control, a vast territory called the Danelaw, where Viking customs, laws, and language held sway. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers wrote in despair of the heathen staying without any peace, but the reality was more complex. In the Danelaw, Norse settlers farmed alongside Anglo-Saxons, traded in bustling markets, and even intermarried. Place names ending in by and thorpe still mark their presence today, quiet echoes of a time when Yorkshire was Jorvik and Viking jarls ruled like kings. What made this conquest so devastating wasn't just military might, but strategy. The sons of Ragnar understood England's weaknesses better than its own rulers. They exploited the petty feuds between Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, striking when kingdoms were divided and weary. When Alfred the Great of Wessex finally rallied resistance, it was almost too late. The Vikings had already rewritten England's map. The Danelaw became a cultural melting pot, blending Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions into something new. Even the English language absorbed Viking words, sky, law, knife, whispering their influence across centuries. The Great Heathen Army didn't just leave ruins in its wake, it forced England into rebirth. By the time Alfred's descendants reclaimed the Danelaw, the kingdom that emerged was stronger, united, and forever marked by the Vikings who had sought to break it. Their conquest proved that even defeat could plant the seeds of change, shaping a nation in ways no one could have foreseen. By the spring of 878, the Viking tide that had swallowed half of England seemed unstoppable until it crashed against the unyielding will of one man. Alfred, the young king of Wessex, had spent months hiding in the marshes of Athelney, watching his kingdom crumble under Guthrum's relentless advance. Most rulers would have surrendered or fled, but Alfred wasn't most rulers. Gathering his scattered forces, he marched to Eddington, a quiet patch of Wiltshire countryside that would become the stage for one of history's great reversals. The battle itself was a masterclass in tactics and tenacity. Alfred's feared a militia of farmers and freemen stood shield to shield against Guthrum's hardened veterans, their axes thirsty for Wessex's last scraps of independence. But Alfred had spent his exile wisely, studying Viking weaknesses. His troops fought in tight formations, their shields overlapping like scales, while his cavalry harried the Norse flanks. For hours, the lines heaved and strained until, at last, Guthrum's forces broke. The Vikings fled to their fortified camp, but Alfred didn't let up. He besieged them for 2 weeks, starving them into submission. When Guthrum finally surrendered, the terms were unlike any Viking leader had ever accepted. The Treaty of Wedmore didn't just demand gold or land, it demanded Guthrum's soul. In a stunning ceremony, the Viking chieftain knelt before Alfred, was baptized as a Christian, and took the name Ethelstan. This wasn't mere pageantry, it was psychological warfare. By embracing the cross, Guthrum acknowledged Alfred's divine right to rule, undermining the Norse belief in their own gods' given destiny. More practically, the treaty drew a clear border. Wessex remained Anglo-Saxon, while the Danelaw retained its Norse customs. Alfred, ever the strategist, knew coexistence would prove stronger than endless war. But Alfred's true genius emerged in the battle's aftermath. He rebuilt Wessex with revolutionary reforms. Fortified towns called burhs formed a defensive network. A standing army replaced seasonal levies, and a fleet of new ships patrolled the coast. Most crucially, he championed education, translating Latin texts into Old English and fostering a literate elite capable of governance. These weren't just defenses against Vikings, they were the foundations of a unified England. Eddington's ripple effect stretched far beyond Wessex. With the English heartland now fortified, Viking ambitions pivoted elsewhere, to France's crumbling Carolingian Empire, to the riches of the Mediterranean, and ultimately to the uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. Guthrum himself kept his bargain, ruling East Anglia peacefully until his death, his warriors trading axes for plows. The age of indiscriminate raiding was fading, replaced by a new era where Norse rulers sought legitimacy, not just loot. Alfred's victory proved the Vikings weren't invincible, just adaptable, and in that lesson lay the future. As Norse ships sailed toward new horizons, they carried not just warriors, but settlers and statesmen, their legacy shifting from terror to transformation. The Battle of Eddington didn't end the Viking Age. It refined it, forcing both sides to evolve in ways that would reshape medieval Europe forever. While England and Ireland reeled from Viking invasions, another group of Norse adventurers set their sights on an entirely different prize, a land of fire and ice where no king's laws could reach them. In the 870s, as Harald Fairhair tightened his grip on Norway, warriors like Ingolfur Arnarsson chose exile over submission, loading their longships with families, livestock, and dreams of independence. Their destination, a windswept island barely touched by humans, where geysers roared and glaciers loomed like frozen giants. Iceland wasn't just a refuge, it became the Vikings' greatest social experiment. Ingolfur's journey embodied the Norse spirit of exploration. Legend says he cast his high seat pillars, sacred wooden posts from his ancestral home, into the sea, vowing to settle wherever the gods washed them ashore. When they landed in a sheltered bay wreathed in steam from hot springs, he named it Reykjavik, Smoke Cove. This wasn't random chance. Iceland's coasts offered rich fishing grounds, while its inland valleys held fertile soil. But survival demanded innovation. Settlers built turf-walled longhouses insulated against brutal winters, devised laws to share scarce resources, and established the Althing in 930, an open-air assembly where free men debated disputes under the summer midnight sun. The world's oldest surviving parliament, It laid the groundwork for democracy 1,000 years before the American Revolution. What made Iceland extraordinary wasn't just its isolation, but its role as a cultural time capsule. While Scandinavia converted to Christianity, Icelanders clung to pagan sagas, preserving myths of Odin and Thor in vivid detail. Skalds recited epic poems at feasts, their words echoing Viking values of honor and fate. The very language froze in time. Modern Icelanders can still read thousand-year-old texts with ease. This wasn't a backward outpost, it was a living museum of Norse identity, where traditions thrived far from Europe's shifting tides. Yet Iceland's true significance lay in what it made possible. From these shores, restless explorers pushed further into the unknown. Men like Eric the Red, exiled for murder, sailed west to Greenland's icy fjords, turning a sentence of banishment into a new dynasty. His son, Leif Erikson, would venture even farther, to a place he called Vinland, where wild grapes grew. The settlement of Iceland wasn't an end point, it was a stepping stone to the edge of the known world, proving that Norse courage could conquer even nature's harshest challenges. The legacy of those first settlers endures. Today, Iceland's volcanoes still tremble with the same forces that awed the Vikings, its people still bound by the all things ancient spirit of debate. In choosing freedom over fealty, Ingolfr and his peers didn't just find a new home, they forged a society that would keep the Viking soul alive long after their longships vanished from history's horizon. Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Eric the Red, wasn't just a man, he was a master of reinvention. Exiled from Norway for murder, then banished from Iceland for more bloodshed, he stood on the icy cliffs of a land most considered uninhabitable and saw opportunity. In 985, with nowhere left to run, Eric did the unthinkable. He turned exile into empire. For 3 years, he explored Greenland's fjords, mapping out pockets of fertile land between the glaciers. But raw survival wasn't enough, he needed settlers. So Eric, the consummate salesman, spun a clever deception. He named the frozen expanse Greenland, a calculated PR move to lure hopeful colonists with visions of lush pastures. People would be more eager to go there, the sagas admit, if it had a favorable name, and it worked. 25 ships set sail from Iceland, though only 14 survived the brutal crossing. Those who made it founded the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, with Eric establishing his estate at Brattahlid. Here, the Norse didn't just endure, they thrived. They built stone and turf churches, raised sheep and cattle in sheltered valleys, and hunted walrus for ivory, Greenland's white gold, that connected them to European trade networks. At its peak, the colony boasted nearly 3,000 souls, a testament to Viking resilience. But Greenland demanded adaptation. The settlers abandoned their signature longships for smaller skin boats, learned to hunt seals from the Inuit, and even adjusted their diet, analysis of their bones revealing a shift from beef to marine mammals as the climate cooled. Yet by the 15th century, the settlements vanished. Theories abound, worsening weather during the Little Ice Age, dwindling trade as elephant ivory replaced walrus tusks, or conflicts with the Thule people. But the truth may be simpler. Greenland was always a gamble, a colony built on Eric's exaggeration and sustained by sheer grit. When the costs outweighed the rewards, the Norse did what their ancestors had done. They moved on. Greenland's greatest legacy, though, lay beyond its shores. From these remote fjords, Eric's son Leif Erikson would hear whispers of lands farther west, rumors passed by a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd been blown off course and glimpsed forested coast. Leif's subsequent voyage to Vinland, likely Newfoundland, marked the first European footsteps in North America, centuries before Columbus. Greenland wasn't just a colony. It was the launchpad for the Viking Age's most audacious leap into the unknown. The settlement's failure couldn't erase its role in history, proof that even the Norse's greatest struggles opened doors to worlds they'd never imagined. Eric the Red's story encapsulates the Viking spirit, reckless, resourceful, and relentlessly forward-looking. He turned banishment into a blueprint for expansion, proving that in the hands of the right leader, even the harshest land could become a homeland. And though Greenland's Norse eventually faded, their brief tenure left an indelible question. If they could reach North America, what other horizons might have been within their grasp? Leif Erikson's journey to Vinland wasn't just a voyage, it was a leap into legend. Around the year 1000, this son of Eric the Red set sail from Greenland, following whispers of a mysterious land to the west. The sagas tell of a chance sighting by a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd been blown off course and glimpsed wooded shores but never landed. Leif, ever the opportunist, bought Bjarni's ship, assembled a crew of 35, and set out to explore. What they found surpassed even their wildest hopes, a place so rich in wild grapes and timber they called it Vinland Wineland. The discovery was staggering. For centuries, Europe had believed the Atlantic an impassable void, yet here were Norse ships docking on North American shores. At Elance Orks Meadows in modern-day Newfoundland, archaeological evidence confirms their presence: iron nails, a bronze cloak pin, and the remnants of turf-walled longhouses identical to those in Iceland. This wasn't a fleeting camp, it was a base for exploration, likely supporting expeditions as far south as New Brunswick or Maine. The sagas describe encounters with indigenous peoples they called Skraelinga, possibly the Beothuk or Micmac, trading furs for milk and red cloth until tensions flared into violence. But why did Vinland fail? The answer lies in logistics and ambition. Greenland's colony, barely sustainable itself, couldn't spare enough settlers to secure a foothold. The Skraelinga, skilled in their own terrain, outnumbered and outmaneuvered the Norse in clashes. Most crucially, Vinland offered no silver or slaves, just timber and grapes, luxuries Greenland couldn't prioritize. Without a steady flow of wealth or reinforcements, the venture collapsed within a decade. Leif's brother Thorvald summed it up bitterly after a skirmish: "We've won a fine and fertile land, but never will we enjoy it." Yet Vinland's true significance transcends its failure. It proved the Vikings could cross the Atlantic, mastering currents and winds with nothing but stars and instinct. Their ships, flexible enough to navigate icy fjords and open ocean alike, became the space shuttles of their age. And while the Norse left no lasting imprint on North America, their sagas preserved the knowledge of these lands, waiting centuries for others to follow. As the Vinland chapter closed, another story was unfolding far to the east, where Viking ambition took a very different shape. While some Norse sought new worlds, others set their sights on the glittering prize of Constantinople, weaving themselves into the fabric of empires rather than forging new ones. The age of exploration wasn't ending, it was branching into realms no one could have predicted. The rivers of Eastern Europe stretched like silver threads through dense forests, and it was here, along these vital waterways, that Viking ambition took its most unexpected turn. Around 882, a Norse warlord named Oleg of Novgorod set his sights on a strategic bluff overlooking the Dnieper River. The local Slavs called it Kyiv, a trading post already humming with activity. But Oleg saw more than a market. He envisioned a fortress city, a hub that would bridge the Scandinavian north and the Byzantine south. According to the primary chronicle, he famously declared, "Let Kyiv be the mother of all Rus cities," before allegedly murdering the ruling brothers Askold and Dyer to seize control. Whether fact or legend, this moment marked the birth of Kievan Rus, a kingdom that would shape the destiny of Eastern Europe. What made Kyiv different from other Viking conquests was its deliberate fusion of cultures. The Rus, Norse traders who'd long plied these rivers, didn't just raid. They married into Slavic families, adopted local dialects, and blended Norse shipbuilding with Slavic agriculture. Over time, their name became synonymous with the land itself, Rus evolving into Russia. Oleg's successors, like Igor and Olga, ruled as Slavic-speaking princes, their Scandinavian roots fading into myth. Yet Viking ingenuity remained. Their riverine fleets controlled trade routes carrying furs, honey, and slaves from the Baltic to the Black Sea, while their fortified settlements became cosmopolitan centers where Arab silver met Byzantine silk. But the Rus weren't content with regional dominance. They craved recognition from the ultimate prize, Constantinople. In 907, Oleg launched an audacious assault on the Byzantine capital, dragging his ships ashore to bypass the city's legendary chains blocking the Golden Horn. The sight of Norse sails outside the Theodosian walls sent shockwaves through the empire. Rather than sack the city, Oleg negotiated a treaty so favorable it stunned contemporaries. Byzantine gold, trade privileges, and even the right for Rus merchants to bathe in Constantinople's baths, a symbolic gesture of equality. This wasn't just a raid, it was a diplomatic coup that positioned Kyiv as Byzantium's peer. Kyiv's legacy lies in its paradoxes. Founded by Vikings, it became the cradle of Slavic orthodoxy after Prince Vladimir's baptism in 988. A hub of violence and slavery, it also birthed Europe's first legal code, the Ruskaya Pravda. The Rus proved conquest wasn't just about taking land, it was about weaving new identities. Today, when modern nations trace their origins to Kievan Rus, they grapple with a truth the Vikings understood. Empires aren't built by blood alone, but by the stories we choose to tell about them. As the Rus solidified their power, another Viking chieftain was turning his gaze south, not toward the splendor of Byzantium, but to the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean. The next chapter of Norse expansion would prove even more surprising, as dragon ships met Saracen fleets in a clash of civilizations neither could have foreseen. The waters of the Bosporus had never seen anything like it. In June of 860, just as Constantinople's citizens settled into their evening routines, 200 Rus longships emerged from the twilight like ghosts. These weren't the familiar traders who bartered furs in the city's markets. These were warriors, their oars slicing the strait with silent precision. The Byzantines, masters of Mediterranean warfare, were caught utterly unprepared. The Rus struck with terrifying speed, pillaging the prince's islands and blockading the Golden Horn. For the first time in living memory, the Theodosian walls, the impregnable shield that had repelled Persians and Arabs, faced an assault from the sea. The psychological impact was profound. Emperor Michael III, away campaigning against the Abbasids, raced back to his capital to find suburbs in flames. Byzantine chroniclers wrote of a barbarian storm and a people never before named, their shock palpable. The Rus didn't just attack, they demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the city's weaknesses, striking its undefended coastal monasteries with surgical precision. Patriarch Photius, in a famous homily, framed the invasion as divine punishment, lamenting how a nation dwelling somewhere far from our country had humbled Christendom's greatest city. Yet the siege's true legacy lay in what followed. When the Rus withdrew, whether repelled or bought off remains debated, they left behind more than scorched earth. They'd proven their naval prowess to an empire that valued military talent above all else. Within decades, Byzantium began recruiting Norse warriors as elite mercenaries, a relationship formalized by the famed Varangian Guard. These axe-wielding foreigners became the emperor's personal bodyguards, their loyalty ensured by distance from local intrigues. The guards' ranks swelled with Scandinavians lured by Byzantine gold, their presence immortalized in runestones back home boasting of service in the land of the Greeks. The economic ramifications were equally transformative. The Ruse Byzantine treaties of 907 and 911 granted Norse merchants unprecedented access to Constantinople's markets. They could now trade duty-free, receive monthly allowances of food and wine, even repair their ships in imperial docks. In return, the empire gained a buffer against Khazar and Bulgar threats, turning former raiders into strategic partners. Silver dirhams from Byzantine coffers flowed north, financing Viking expeditions from Dublin to the Caspian. But Constantinople was just the beginning. Emboldened by their Byzantine dealings, Norse adventurers pushed deeper into the Mediterranean. In the mid-9th century, a Viking named Haystein led a fleet through the Strait of Gibraltar, raiding the coasts of North Africa and Italy before wintering in the Camargue. Others sacked Pisa and Luna, the latter famously duped by Haystein's fake funeral ruse. These campaigns, though smaller than the ruse exploits, proved no corner of Europe was beyond the reach of Norse ambition. From the golden domes of Constantinople to the olive groves of Andalusia, the Vikings weren't just invading, they were integrating themselves into the very fabric of Eurasian power. The siege of 860 didn't just change Byzantine history, it redefined what Viking expansion could be. No longer confined to hit-and-run raids, the Norse now played the game of empires, their axes balanced by diplomatic cunning. When the Ruse Prince Oleg later nailed his shield to Constantinople's gates, it wasn't just a declaration of war, it was a statement of belonging. The Vikings had arrived on history's grandest stage, and they had no intention of leaving. In the scorching summer of 844, the people of Al-Andalus Muslim-ruled Spain faced an unimaginable sight. Viking longships, those dreaded symbols of northern terror, appeared at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, their dragon prows casting shadows on Andalusian shores. No one expected these seafarers of the icy fjords to brave the fierce currents and scorching sun of southern Iberia. Yet here they were, sailing deep into the heart of Islamic territory. Their target, the wealthy city of Seville, a jewel of the Umayyad Emirate. The initial assault was devastating. The Vikings, led by a chieftain the Arab chroniclers called Magus Pagans, stormed the city's outskirts, overwhelming local defenses with ruthless efficiency. For weeks they held Seville, plundering its mosques, markets, and homes, even sacking the nearby town of Coria del Rio. The emir's forces, caught off guard by this unprecedented threat, scrambled to respond. But what made this invasion remarkable wasn't just its audacity. It was the Vikings' ability to adapt to an entirely foreign landscape. They navigated unfamiliar rivers, fought in blistering heat, and faced tactics unlike anything they'd encountered in England or Francia. Emir Abd al-Rahman II, however, wasn't about to let these northern intruders upend his realm. He mobilized a disciplined army of Berber cavalry, Andalusian infantry, and even a fleet of hastily assembled ships to trap the Vikings. The decisive battle unfolded near Tablada, where the emir's forces used flaming arrows and coordinated charges to break the Norse lines. Those who survived fled back to their ships, but their retreat came at a cost. Dozens of longships were captured, and many Vikings were executed or enslaved. Some, intriguingly, chose to stay, converting to Islam and settling as cheesemakers and mercenaries, proof that even in defeat, the Norse could reinvent themselves. The raids on Al-Andalus revealed both the Vikings' staggering reach and the limits of their power. They could strike anywhere from the frozen north to the Mediterranean sun-baked coasts, but they couldn't always hold what they took. Yet their impact lingered. The emir, shaken by the attack, ordered new shipyards and coastal watchtowers, reshaping Al-Andalus defenses. Meanwhile, the Vikings, undeterred by their losses, redirected their ambitions elsewhere, particularly to a stretch of Frankish coastline that would become their most enduring legacy, Normandy. This was no random shift in strategy. After decades of raiding, some Norse leaders realized that permanent settlement offered more than fleeting plunder. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple, weary of constant Viking incursions, struck a deal with a wily chieftain named Rollo. In exchange for loyalty and conversion to Christianity, Rollo would receive lands along the Seine's estuary, a buffer zone against future raids. What began as a pragmatic truce birthed the Duchy of Normandy, where Norse and Frankish cultures fused into something entirely new. The Vikings of Normandy traded their longships for plows, their war gods for saints, yet their restless spirit endured, soon propelling their descendants, the Normans, to even greater conquest. The raids on Al-Andalus and the founding of Normandy marked a turning point. The age of mindless plunder was giving way to an era of calculated settlement, where Viking descendants would reshape kingdoms rather than just raid them. From the ashes of burned monasteries and the treaties of weary kings, a new chapter of history was being written, one where the Norse weren't just invaders, but architects of the medieval world. The Seine River had been a Viking highway for decades, its waters carrying Norse raiders deep into the heart of Francia. But by 911, the game had changed. Charles the Simple, the beleaguered Frankish king, faced a dilemma. His realm was bleeding silver from endless Danegeld payments, and his nobles were growing restless. Meanwhile, a hulking Viking chieftain named Rollo, tired of hit-and-run raids, saw an opportunity. Their meeting would alter European history forever. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte wasn't just a truce, it was a blueprint for transformation. In exchange for swearing loyalty to Charles, converting to Christianity, and shielding Francia from future Viking attacks, Rollo received a swath of coastal land along the lower Seine. On paper, it was a vassalage arrangement, but both men knew the truth. This was the birth of Normandy, a Viking state on Frankish soil. Rollo's followers, now called Normans, Northmen, adopted Frankish customs with startling speed. They married local women, embraced feudal law, and even traded their Norse tongue for Old French. Yet beneath the surface, Viking ingenuity thrived. Norman castles blended Norse timber techniques with stone keeps. Their cavalry adapted Viking ferocity to armored charges, and their ships remained the envy of Europe. What made Normandy unique was its dual identity. These were Vikings who traded paganism for papal favor, yet retained their ancestors' hunger for conquest. Within generations, their descendants would eclipse the achievements of their raiding forebears. In 1066, William the Conqueror, a direct descendant of Rollo, crossed the English Channel with an army that mixed Norman knights with Viking-style amphibious tactics, toppling Anglo-Saxon rule at Hastings. Meanwhile, other Norman adventurers like Robert Guiscard carved kingdoms from southern Italy and Sicily, their hybrid culture producing dazzling mosaics in Palermo's churches and polyglot courts where Arabic, Greek, and Latin flowed freely. The founding of Normandy proved the Vikings' greatest talent wasn't destruction, it was reinvention. By grafting Norse resilience onto Frankish feudalism, they created a culture uniquely suited to shape the medieval world. And as the Normans expanded, they carried with them a lesson first learned on the banks of the Seine. Conquest lasts longest when conquerors become something new. But while Normandy's story is well known, other Viking ventures left equally surprising legacies in places far from the spotlight, like the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, where Norse axes once rang against Saracen scimitars. By the autumn of 937, England stood at a crossroads. King Aethelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, had spent decades stitching together the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a unified realm, only to face the ultimate test of his vision. On a blood-soaked field near Brunanburh, a colossal coalition gathered against him. Norse warriors from Dublin under Olaf Guthfrithson, Scots led by Constantine II, and even disgruntled Britons from Strathclyde. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was a do-or-die moment for England's survival as a nation. The battle itself was a maelstrom of clashing steel and shifting fortunes. Aethelstan's forces, hardened by years of Viking wars, fought in tight shield walls while his cavalry outmaneuvered the enemy flanks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle immortalized the carnage in vivid verse. The field grew dark with blood. 5 young kings lay dead by swords, 7 of Olaf's earls. By day's end, the allied army broke in chaos with Constantine's own son among the fallen. The victory was so decisive that chroniclers called it the greatest battle since the Saxons first came to Britain. Brunanburh's true impact, though, wasn't measured in corpses but in legacy. Aethelstan's triumph crushed the last major challenge to a united England, proving his realm could withstand even a combined invasion. Norse ambitions in Britain suffered a mortal blow. Olaf slunk back to Ireland, his dreams of reviving the Danelaw in ashes. The battle's poetic commemoration wasn't mere celebration. It was propaganda, crafting a narrative of English destiny that future kings would invoke. For the Vikings, Brunanburh marked a turning point. Their era of reshaping Britain through sheer force was fading, replaced by a new calculus of diplomacy and assimilation. Yet twilight doesn't mean darkness. While Brunanburh slowed Norse resurgence, it didn't extinguish their influence. Viking descendants still ruled York intermittently, and Norse bloodlines mingled with Anglo-Saxon nobility, including future kings like Cnut. What changed was the playing field. No longer could Viking warlords carve kingdoms from chaos. Now they had to navigate the world Aethelstan had forged. The age of unchecked raiding gave way to an era of crowns and conversions, where power flowed as much from baptismal fonts as from battle axes. As the 10th century waned, the Viking story pivoted from conquest to legacy. Their DNA lingered in the veins of European royalty, their sagas whispered in monastic scriptoria, their shipbuilding techniques copied from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The thunder of Brunanburh didn't silence the Norse. It simply merged their echoes into the chorus of a changing world. The morning of September 25, 1066, dawned crisp and clear over the village of Stamford Bridge, a quiet crossing point over the River Derwent that would soon become a stage for history's last great Viking act. Harald Hardrada, the towering Norwegian king known as the Thunderbolt of the North, had landed in England with 300 longships and an unshakable belief in his destiny. His claim to the English throne was thin but audacious, resting on a decades-old promise made to his predecessor, Magnus the Good. Together with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's King Harold, Hardrada's forces had already crushed the northern earls at Fulford. Victory seemed certain, but what awaited them at Stamford Bridge wasn't just an army, it was the end of an era. King Harold Godwinson's march north was a masterpiece of speed and deception. Covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, his Saxon housecarls caught the Norse completely off guard, finding them basking in the sun, many without armor. The sagas tell of a lone Viking berserker who held the bridge single-handedly, his axe cutting down 40 men before an English soldier floated beneath the planks in a barrel and speared him from below. Whether myth or fact, the image endures, a final, defiant stand of Viking fury against the tides of change. Hardrada himself fought like a man possessed, but an arrow to the throat sealed his fate. As the Norwegian king fell, so too did the last great dream of a Scandinavian England. Yet history had one cruel twist left. Even as Harold's weary forces celebrated their victory, word arrived from the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. The Saxon army, battered but triumphant, now faced a grueling forced march back to Sussex. By October 14th, at Hastings, the exhausted housecarls met William's disciplined Normans, descendants of Vikings themselves. Their cavalry charges a world apart from the shield walls of Stamford Bridge. When Harold fell beneath a hail of Norman arrows, the crown passed not to another Saxon or Norse claimant, but to a new breed of conqueror. The irony was profound. The Viking Age, born in fire at Lindisfarne nearly 3 centuries earlier, met its symbolic end at Stamford Bridge, only for Viking bloodlines to triumph weeks later at Hastings through William the Conqueror, Rollo's great-great-grandson. The Norse didn't vanish, they evolved. Their DNA threaded through European royalty. Their shipbuilding techniques revolutionized Mediterranean navies, and their sagas inspired generations. From the Varangian guards of Byzantium to the Norman kingdoms of Sicily, the Viking spirit endured not as raiders, but as shapers of empires. Stamford Bridge wasn't an ending. It was a passing of the torch, proving that even in defeat, the Northmen's legacy was far from spent. The story of Hastings in 1066 is often told as a clash between Saxons and Normans, but peel back the layers, and you'll find it's really the Viking saga's final, glorious twist. William the Conqueror, that iron-willed Duke of Normandy, traced his lineage straight back to Rollo, the same Norse chieftain who'd carved a Viking homeland from Frankish soil 2 centuries earlier. The blood of raiders pumped through his veins, and his invasion fleet, though filled with knights in gleaming mail, moved with the same ruthless precision as the longships of old. When his troops landed at Pevensey that September, it wasn't just a foreign army coming ashore, it was the ghost of Viking ambition, returning to claim the prize its ancestors had coveted for generations. What unfolded on October 14th wasn't merely a battle for England's crown. It was a collision of worlds. Harold's Saxon housecarls fought in the traditional shield wall, their 2-handed axes cleaving through Norman ranks, while William's forces employed feigned retreats, archers, and cavalry charges tactics honed from the fusion of Viking daring and Frankish discipline. By nightfall, as Harold lay dead beneath a tattered banner, the victors raised a cry not in Latin or Old French, but in the Norse tongue of their forebears, Kyrie eleison. The echoes of Viking war chants lingered in that cheer, a haunting reminder that the conquerors of England were, at heart, Northmen in new armor. The aftermath reshaped England at its core. Norman French became the language of courts and castles, grafting thousands of new words onto Anglo-Saxon roots, giving us a beef from Beowulf, while the Saxon serfs herded cows. Feudalism tightened its grip, with William parceling out lands to loyal barons in a system that owed as much to Norse clan loyalty as to Frankish tradition. Even the landscape transformed, as wooden Saxon halls gave way to towering stone keeps like the Tower of London, built with the same defensive ingenuity as the fortresses of Normandy's Viking founders. Yet the most enduring changes were cultural. Norse-style administrative efficiency met Saxon legal traditions in the Domesday Book, a census so thorough it felt like Odin's all-seeing gaze. The Norman passion for record-keeping inherited from their Frankish mentors preserved England's history even as they rewrote it. Over centuries, this fusion birthed a new identity, no longer purely Anglo-Saxon or Norse, but something uniquely English. The true irony, William's victory ensured that Viking descendants would rule England for centuries through Plantagenet kings and beyond, while Old Norse words like sky, law, and knife seeped into everyday speech. The Normans didn't erase England's past, they layered it, like a palimpsest where runes shimmer beneath illuminated Latin script. In the end, the Viking Age didn't so much end at Hastings as evolve, trading dragon prows for feudal banners while keeping that restless Norse spirit alive in the marrow of medieval Europe. From the ashes of conquest rose a nation forever changed not by the destruction of its roots, but by the grafting of new branches onto ancient trunks. The descendants of Rollo, once reviled as pagan raiders, had become the architects of a world where Viking, Saxon, and Frankish threads wove together into the tapestry we now call the Middle Ages. The longships that once carried Thor's hammer amulets now bore crosses, and the change wasn't just symbolic, it was seismic. By the late 10th century, as Viking warlords like Olaf Tryggvason ascended to power, they faced a stark choice: cling to the old gods and remain Europe's outcasts, or embrace Christianity and join the continent's political chessboard. Olaf, a former raider turned king, chose the latter with ruthless conviction. His methods were anything but gentle. When Norwegian chieftains balked at abandoning Odin, Olaf reportedly dragged them to a cliff's edge, offering baptism or a fatal plunge. "I'll make all Norway Christian or die trying," he vowed. This wasn't just faith, it was statecraft. Christian kings could trade with Frankish bishops, marry into Saxon royalty, and legitimize their rule in the eyes of a Europe that had long viewed Vikings as bogeymen. The ideological shift rippled through Norse society. Pagan temples fell, their carvings of Thor and Freya replaced by stave churches adorned with crosses. The old burial rites sending chiefs to Valhalla in burning ships gave way to churchyard graves, yet the transition was never absolute. Farmers still whispered charms to Odin for good harvests, and the sagas kept pagan myths alive under a Christian veneer. This fusion birthed a unique Nordic Christianity, where saints took on traits of the old gods and Yule celebrations blended with Christmas. The Vikings didn't just adopt a new faith, they remade it in their image. Christianization's geopolitical impact was profound. No longer seen as pagan marauders, Norse rulers could now negotiate as equals. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark used his baptism to secure alliances against Germany, while his son Cnut leveraged Christian piety to rule England as a most merciful king. The church, in turn, gained a foothold in the north, its monasteries becoming hubs for preserving Norse history, even as they erased pagan traditions. The very raids that had terrorized Europe dwindled not because Vikings grew weaker, but because their elites now had more to gain from tithes than plunder. Yet the Viking spirit didn't vanish. It migrated into new forms: crusading fervor in Jerusalem, missionary zeal in Greenland, even the bureaucratic efficiency of Norman kingdoms. Their DNA endured. Two modern studies reveal Scandinavian markers in places as far-flung as Ireland's coasts and Russia's river valleys. The Christianization of Scandinavia didn't erase the Vikings, it gave their legacy a passport to the medieval mainstream. From the stone churches of Trondheim to the DNA of millions, the Northmen's imprint proved as enduring as the crosses they carved into runestones, a testament to their greatest conquest, not of land but of time itself. The genetic fingerprints of the Vikings linger in places you might never expect, not just in Scandinavia, but woven into the DNA of millions across Europe and beyond. Modern studies reveal a startling truth. Those fierce Norse explorers didn't just raid and trade, they settled, intermarried, and left behind invisible marks that endure in living populations today. Take the British Isles, where recent genetic mapping shows up to 6% of the population in certain regions like the Shetland Islands or parts of Yorkshire, carry distinct Norse ancestry. In Ireland, coastal towns once frequented by Viking traders still show higher concentrations of Scandinavian genetic markers, proving that the Norse weren't just passing through, they became part of the fabric of these communities. But perhaps the most surprising legacy lies in the east. Along the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, DNA studies trace Viking roots in modern populations, particularly among groups historically linked to the Kievan Rus. The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled Russia for centuries, claimed descent from the Viking chieftain Rurik, and genetic evidence suggests they weren't just spinning myths. Even in Iceland, where isolation might suggest purity, the gene pool tells a different story, a mix of Norse and Gaelic ancestry, reflecting the Irish and Scottish slaves and wives brought by settlers. This genetic tapestry shatters the romanticized notion of pure Viking bloodlines. The Norse weren't a closed tribe of blonde warriors. They were absorbers and adapters, blending with the people they encountered. In Normandy, their DNA dissolved into the local population within generations, leaving behind cultural innovations rather than distinct genetic signatures. Yet their impact was undeniable. From the red hair of some Irish families to certain immune system traits in Baltic populations, Viking genes still whisper their presence in subtle, unexpected ways. Modern perceptions, though, often cling to stereotypes: horns on helmets, mindless brutality, a people frozen in time. Science tells a richer story, one of migration, integration, and quiet biological legacy. The real Vikings weren't just destroyers, they were ancestors, their blood flowing in veins from Dublin to Novgorod. Their greatest conquest wasn't measured in silver or land, but in the living heritage of those who carry their DNA, a reminder that history isn't just written in books, but etched into our very cells. Hollywood would have you believe every Viking warrior wore horned helmets and spent their days pillaging villages with unwashed hair and blood-streaked faces. The reality, archaeologists have yet to find a single authentic Viking Age helmet with horns. Those were added by 19th century opera costume designers for Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen. The truth about Norse hygiene would shock most filmmakers. Excavations reveal grooming kits with tweezers, ear cleaners, and even eyeliner. Norse sagas describe weekly baths, and Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan noted Vikings washed their faces and heads daily, more frequently than many Europeans at the time. Gender roles in Viking society also defy modern stereotypes. While pop culture fixates on burly male warriors, archaeology tells a different story. The Birka burial in Sweden, once assumed to hold a high-ranking male warrior, was revealed through DNA analysis to be a woman surrounded by swords, shields, and 2 horses. Similar finds across Scandinavia suggest women could hold property, initiate divorces, and even lead expeditions. The sagas brim with formidable figures like Freydis Eiriksdottir, who reportedly fought off indigenous attackers in Vinland while pregnant. These weren't just exceptions, they reflect a society with fluid roles where capability often trumped gender. The biggest misconception of all, Vikings weren't just raiders, they were master traders whose routes spanned continents. A single hoard in Gotland contained coins from Samarkand to North Africa, while excavations in York revealed workshops producing goods for export as far as Constantinople. Their economic network was so sophisticated they established standardized weights and silver currency systems centuries before medieval Europe. Even their terror had nuance. Many raids targeted monasteries not just for gold, but because these were political power centers holding wealth extracted from local peasants. Recent scholarship continues to rewrite Viking history. Isotope analysis of teeth shows some Vikings buried in Scandinavia grew up in Ireland or Scotland, proving their communities were multicultural hubs. Meanwhile, climate science reveals how the medieval warm period enabled their westward expansion. a reminder that environmental factors shaped history as much as human ambition. So why does separating myth from reality matter? Because the Vikings' true legacy isn't about mindless violence, it's about adaptability. They thrived by absorbing new ideas, from adopting Christianity to blending with Slavic cultures in ruse. In an era of polarized identities, their story reminds us that civilizations grow not through purity, but through exchange. The next time you see a horned helmet on screen, remember, the real Vikings didn't need Hollywood's theatrics. Their actual achievements crossing oceans, bridging cultures, reshaping continents were dramatic enough. The Viking Age offers more than just tales of conquest. It's a masterclass in human adaptability. These were people who thrived not by brute force alone, but by their uncanny ability to reinvent themselves in every land they touched. Consider their ships. The same sleek longships that raided Lindisfarne became the vessels that carried settlers to Iceland, traders to Baghdad, and explorers to North America. Their maritime technology didn't just change their own fortunes, it laid the groundwork for later eras of global exploration. The Portuguese caravels of the 15th century owed a debt to Norse hull designs, while Viking star navigation techniques foreshadowed the tools of the Age of Discovery. The lesson, true innovation isn't just about invention, it's about iteration, taking what works and refining it for new frontiers. Yet their greatest strength lay in cultural fluidity. The Vikings didn't conquer in a vacuum, they absorbed, blended, and evolved. In Ireland, they became city builders. In Ruse, they shaped dynasties. In Normandy, they transformed into feudal lords. This chameleon-like ability to adopt local customs while retaining core strengths explains their enduring influence. When Norse settlers in Greenland began sewing Inuit-style sealskin clothing, or Sicilian Normans commissioned Arabic-speaking scribes, they weren't betraying their heritage, they were expanding it. Their legacy reminds us that cultures grow not through isolation, but through exchange. But let's temper admiration with clarity. Modern retellings often sanitize Viking history, either romanticizing their violence or whitewashing their slave trade. The truth sits uncomfortably in between, a people capable of both stunning artistry and staggering cruelty. Their rune stones memorialize fallen kinsmen with poetic grace, yet their raids devastated communities from Cork to Constantinople. This duality matters because it resists easy categorization. We can praise their legal systems and shipbuilding while acknowledging the human cost of their expansion. History isn't about hero worship or condemnation, it's about understanding complexity. What ultimately made the Vikings transformative wasn't their swords, but their synapses. They looked at the open ocean and saw highways, not barriers, met foreign cultures and saw partners, not just prey. In an era where borders seemed to harden and identities turned defensive, their example whispers a counterintuitive truth. Survival belongs not to the purest, but to the most adaptable. As we close this saga, remember the real Viking legacy isn't frozen in time beneath burial mounds. It lives on in every explorer who dares beyond the horizon, every society that thrives by embracing change, and every culture brave enough to redefine itself without forgetting where it began. Walk into any English courtroom, and you'll hear echoes of Viking legal traditions in words like law, itself lifted straight from the Old Norse lag. But the Norse didn't just leave behind vocabulary, they shaped the very foundations of governance. Take Iceland's Althing, established in 930 as an open-air assembly where free men settled disputes under the sky. This wasn't just a precursor to modern parliaments, it was a radical experiment in collective decision-making, proving that Viking society valued debate as much as battle axes. Even the concept of a jury traces back to Norse customs, where local communities, not distant kings, determined justice. language itself carries the Vikings' fingerprints. Every time you say window from vindauga or wind-eye, egg, or even husband from husbandi, meaning householder, you're speaking a dialect shaped by Norse settlers. Days of the week honor their gods: Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigga, a subtle reminder of how deeply pagan roots entwined with Christian Europe. In northern England, street names ending in gate, like York's Coppergate, derive from the Norse gata, meaning street, while Scottish kirk towns borrow their word for church. These aren't just linguistic relics, they're proof of cultural assimilation, where Norse and local tongues blended into something new. Place names tell an even richer story. From Dublin's Norse-founded docks to Normandy's rolling countryside, geography itself became a canvas for Viking identity. In England's Danelaw, villages like Grimsby, Grimstown, and Whitby, White Settlement, dot the landscape like runestones marking territory. Across the Atlantic, Greenland's very name, a marketing ploy by Eric the Red, shows how Norse explorers understood the power of branding. Even in Russia, where the Rus Vikings founded Kyiv, river routes still bear names they charted, stitching Norse navigation into Slavic geography. Perhaps their most enduring legacy, though, was as medieval globalization's shock troops. Before Marco Polo or Columbus, Vikings connected Baghdad's silver mines to York's markets, Byzantine silks to Norwegian fjords. Their trade networks became the prototype for the Hanseatic League, while their settlement patterns from Ireland's coastal hubs to Russia's river ports laid groundwork for urban Europe. The very idea of a pan-European identity owes debts to these seafarers who refused to see borders as barriers. The Vikings didn't just raid history, they rewrote it, leaving behind not just plundered gold but the living DNA of modern life. When Icelanders draft laws today in their Viking-descended language, or when New Yorkers stroll down streets named by Dutch settlers who inherited Norse urban planning, the past isn't dead. It's threading through our present, a reminder that the fiercest conquerors aren't those who take land, but those who change how we think, speak, and govern long after their swords have rusted away. From the blood-soaked shores of Lindisfarne to the sun-baked walls of Constantinople, the Vikings didn't just raid, they rewrote the map of the medieval world. Their 20 most notorious conquests weren't isolated acts of violence. They were the brushstrokes of a grand historical canvas, blending destruction with creation, terror with transformation. Consider the sheer scope. They shattered Anglo-Saxon England into the Danelaw, then watched as Alfred the Great forged it back stronger. They turned the rivers of Russia into highways of trade, birthing the Kievan Rus, a dynasty that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. They planted cities like Dublin and York, not as temporary camps, but as bustling hubs of commerce and culture where Norse and Gaelic traditions fused into something new. Everywhere they went, the Vikings left more than ruins, they left legacies. But to call them mere warriors would be to miss the full picture. These were people of startling contradictions. The same hands that wielded axes in Parisian streets also crafted exquisite jewelry and carved runestones with poetic elegance. The minds that plotted the sack of Seville navigated star paths to Iceland and beyond, their longships becoming the space probes of the medieval world. They built slave markets, yes, but also parliaments like Iceland's Althing, where free men debated laws under open skies. Their greatest talent wasn't just taking land, but adapting to it, becoming Norman knights, Rus princes, or Greenlandic farmers as the moment demanded. The proof of their impact lingers not just in history books, but in our daily lives. When an English speaker says they, them, or our, they're using Old Norse pronouns that elbowed their way into Anglo-Saxon speech. When a New Yorker walks down Wall Street, They tread a path named for the earthworks Vikings once built there. From the jury systems of modern courts to the democratic ideals of Iceland, the Northmen's influence is woven into the fabric of societies they once terrorized. Even their failures, like the fleeting Vinland settlement, pushed the boundaries of the possible, proving continents could be crossed centuries before Columbus. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just picture horned helmets and burning villages. See the shipwrights whose designs revolutionized naval warfare, the traders who connected Baghdad to Bergen, the poets who preserved myths we still retell today. Their story isn't one of mindless brutality, but of relentless reinvention, a reminder that history's most transformative figures are rarely one-dimensional. What other hidden threads might these Norse explorers have woven into our world? Perhaps the answer lies in a surname, a local legend, or even your own DNA. The age of the Vikings may have ended, but the search for their true legacy has only just begun. Share your thoughts below. What Viking influence surprises you most? If these 20 Viking conquests left you hungry for more, don't miss the reading list waiting in the description, packed with sagas, scholarly deep dives, and even a few gripping novels that bring this era to life. And if you've enjoyed this voyage through history, a like and subscribe helps us chart the course for future adventures. Speaking of which, what's next? Will we unravel the tangled web of Viking mythology, where gods and giants clash in epic battles, or perhaps follow the descendants of Rollo as they morph from Norse raiders into the Norman conquerors who reshaped England at Hastings? One thing's certain, the age of the Vikings may be over, but their legacy sails on in our languages, our laws, and the very maps we navigate today. So until next time, keep exploring. The past isn't just behind us, it's all around.